hermenein, which means to interpret. So probably this word is related to Hermes of the Greek pantheon. The equivalent of it in Latin, in the Latin list of gods, is Mercury. Mercury, what do you call this? The Mercury store has basically this image. The job of this god was to transmit the messages of the gods in a language understandable to mortals. That's why part of his work was to already interpret the message in a way that could be understood by the recipient. So Hermes, in this sense, did the first uh, uh, hermeneutics. So he was the first one to employ basically this science. But formally, the meaning basically is two. You have a broad meaning and a narrow meaning to it. So the broader meaning means that it is a science or art of interpretation, and it deals with the conditions that make understanding possible, and even with the process of understanding as a whole. So anything that has something to do with interpretation is included in the scope of the broad meaning of hermeneutics. The narrow meaning would refer to the methods and techniques that are used to interpret written text. In the context of the Bible, it is called exegesis. It's not probably exactly the same, but at least they're related to one another. So, whereas hermeneutics, this is a distinction between hermeneutics and exegesis. So, hermeneutics is associated with the theory of interpretation, so it's much more general and universal in scope. Exegesis deals more with its practice, so it's more focused. So hermeneutics is the process of careful and analytical study of biblical passages to be able to produce a useful interpretation. The goal is to know neither less nor more than the information actually contained in those passages. So if it's not there, don't actually say it. And if the text is not saying it, don't impose it on the text. Otherwise, that will exegesis is drawing out the meaning from the text, and eisegesis is actually putting your own meaning into the text, trying to interpret it according to what you want. So to be able to avoid confusion, in general, in practice, we just use the more common word interpretation when we speak of hermeneutics. At least what is important today is you have encountered this word, because this is not only used in the Bible, it is also used in theology, in philosophy, and anything that involves, even in literature, that involves texts. So you need, or that involves language. So you will involve definitely interpretation or hermeneutics. So interpretation is already okay to use. Now, some key ideas regarding this whole practice of hermeneutics or interpretation that we need to have at the back of our mind, particularly when it comes to the Bible. So these are the things that we should have always at the back of our mind when we are dealing with the text of the scripture. The first one, interpretation is by nature both objective and subjective. So the interpretation of any written record is the exposition of the author's meaning in terms of our own thought patterns. So that means the text has its own author, and interpretation is trying to understand what the author is trying to say in his or her text, but in a way that we uses our own thought patterns to grab or to catch basically the meaning. So though we may try to think the author's thoughts after him, like be as objective as possible, ultimately, our own mind must determine the way in which we grasp and express his meaning. So we are subjective. So these two things can, as much as possible, we try to observe but definitely we can never separate the two absolutely. We can never also be objective absolutely, because that is basically understanding the real author's thoughts about basically the things, and it's difficult to do that. Even if you are very close to the author, it will still actually there will still be things that would escape you. So that's why most of the time we are more subjective, because that's the easiest way to use in terms of looking at and interpreting things in front of us. So the interplay between the subjective and the objective elements is very pronounced in biblical interpretation. How? Because it's when you read a text, and if you know basically like it's written in a language that you understand, it's easy to actually say that I know what the author is trying to say. Of course, when we say that, we're just saying that I know basically the mind of the author according to how I understand him. So basically, that's already my own reading of the text itself. So these are generally an experience that we have. No matter how hard we try to be as objective as possible, we can never do away with our subjectivity. We can say that biblical interpretation is not scientific in the sense that it is not free from presuppositions and prejudices. So when we interpret the text, even if we try to be scientific, there will always be presuppositions and prejudices that we'll have to take to mind. The biases due to faith, for example, and tradition would play a great role in our interpretation. That's why, according to the International Biblical Commission text number 107, exegetes necessarily bring certain presuppositions to biblical writings. In the case of the Catholic exegete, it is a question entrusted to the church for the nurturing of faith and guidance of the Christian life. So basically, it's just saying that as a Catholic, we have a certain bias. So don't be surprised if the other Christian denominations, like the Protestant groups, will also have their own bias in terms of interpretation. That's what I'm saying, that when you are trying to argue with other people from other denominations, it's just an exercise in futility, because no one will actually surrender basically their position. So that's why they will argue to be able to show who is uppermost or have upper hand in the discussion. But in the end, what's the point? So the other one will not give in. You will not give in. You will. So what happens? You will always end up fighting over it. When the most important thing for us is we interpret the text, not so much for others but for ourselves, so that we'll be able to live it out in our lives. And of course, the community, the Christian community as well, can come together and interpret the text as well for the community's sake as well, so that the word of God can transform. On the other hand, at the same time, it is our interpretation of the text, our biblical interpretation is scientific also, in the sense that it requires rigorous scientific, historical, textual, and literary analysis. So we also do our homework. We just don't basically read it, and then after I read it, my interpretation is already okay. So I study it. Like I go through I use basically all the tools possible to help me study deeply and appreciate deeply what the text is trying to say. That's why we study the history, we study the text, how it is written, and we also basically use literary analysis to be able to really decipher and then see basically the meaning sometimes that are hidden in the text in itself. So here we're saying that instead of using the word objective and subjective, we also say that sometimes we are not scientific in the sense that we have biases and prejudices and presuppositions, and yet at the same time, we can also do a scientific study of the text. So in our context, that is what we're trying to do, to basically inform you and give you basically the leads and the tools to be able to study the text in a more scientific way, in a more objective way. not just basically reading and interpreting it. This is how I understand it, and that's it. No, we need also to study the text scientifically. And many people have already done a great job making our work today easy. We just have to refer to them and read them as well, like books, commentaries, articles, and so on, that has been written and a product of real rigorous researches and so on. Now, the second, if you have questions, you can just interrupt me since I cannot see your hand. So you just basically tell me. The second one, the second item or that we need to always remember is that biblical texts express both literary and religious concerns. So to interpret them, the text, we must be willing to respond conversation with their questions and concerns, both literary and religious. So interpretation is a conversation between text and interpreter on the religious subject matter can be described as correlation. So, of course, as a literary material, people can approach the text in different ways. But people with religious sentiments and with faith can actually look at it differently as well. But it doesn't mean that we only focus on the religious interpretation of it. It's also important that as a literary text, we can also make use of literary analysis in interpreting the text. So, in terms of religious experience, from the vantage point of religion or people with faith, so basically this interpretation as a conversation between text and interpreter is called correlation. And this correlation would allow three spectra of possible interpretations between the text and the reader. That means when we interpret the text, when we read it, reflect on it, and interpret it, this basically happens in these three different ways. The first one is confrontation. So in this spectrum, what happens is the reader interprets the text by contrasting it with his own experiences and ideas. In concrete, this means that when you talk about a text, for example, you say gospel, and you are in a prayer meeting, and you basically share your thoughts about it, and you say, the gospel is talking about something that is not true for me. So you're trying to contrast it. Or you say, I'm not the same with the person that the gospel is talking about. So you contrast yourself with what the text is saying. That's one way of interpreting it. Whether that is true or not, we'll never be able to know if the person is telling the truth or if the person is just hiding something. But anyway, let's just basically give him the benefit of the doubt. But that is one way of interpreting the text. We try to say, it doesn't apply to me. Anyway, although obviously for some people you may just be smiling and say, no, it applies to you. But anyway, the person who is interpreting can actually do that, contrast himself with it. The second one is similarity difference. So the reader would understand the text by finding similarities with or differences from his own ideas and experiences. So when you're interpreting sometimes or sharing about the text, you say, in this portion of the text, this is true for me, but the second one is not. So you say this one is similar in my experience, the other one is different. So it's not the whole thing, it's not the whole text, but there are elements in the passage that you say you can identify with, and there are elements that you basically say it's not me, or it's not, it doesn't, I don't share that view, and so on. So you look at the similarity and the difference. And the third one is identity, which basically means that you're affirming the text because it affirms your own ideas and experiences. It's almost like saying when you are sharing that some people would always say, the text, the passage that we have today, or the gospel passage that we're reflecting on today, really hits me like a hammer hitting a nail in its head. So that means you really are bullseye. So you identify basically with the text. There. So that's how we interpret, especially in our experiences as a people of faith in our religious experience. That's how we interpret the text. We just have to. You can use basically these different ways of interpreting it, but hopefully, in the end, it will help us grow by discovering what is really the truth about our own experiences, as well as what the gospel or the Bible is telling us about it. So that's correlation, confrontation, similar difference, and identity. The third thing that we should remember about interpreting is that an interpreter should be aware of three realities in our lives, in ourselves, that inevitably creep into our work, into our interpretation. So that means there are three things that we have in our own life, in our own person, that can actually get in the way, whether positively or influence, or positively or negatively, our interpretation. So the point that is important for us to do is that the more we are aware of them, the more that we can take account of them. So that means it's not wrong to have those three realities. I mean, that's part of life. But what is important is that we take charge and we make sure that this doesn't basically dominate our own interpretation of text. So these are basically what we can call probably part of our biases. The first one is that the inevitable pressure of the interpreter's own pre-understanding. So that means whether you like it or not, your mind is not empty. It's not a tabula rasa. So it is filled with biases and presuppositions that you have basically put together since you could probably since the time that you started understanding. So there are a lot of things, there are a lot of experiences in our life, and there are a lot of relationships in our lives that has given us basically some biases and presuppositions, and we cannot avoid that. So that biases and presupposition is an inevitable pressure that will really basically influence our interpretation. That's why we're always asked, like when we are asked to be objective, we are asked to basically check what are our biases and presuppositions. Some of these biases and presuppositions are not necessarily all of them negative. Some of them are positive, but it's just you just have to understand, because biases and presuppositions are also limitations in terms of interpretation. The second one is that the claim to attention of the text itself. This pressure is difficult because it is the capacity of the text to entice us influences our interpretations. So sometimes it is the text itself that can actually influence us so much so that it can actually change our lives and maybe make us turn around in our life 360 degrees. I can One example that I can cite probably is the experience of Saint Augustine that brought basically his own conversion. He was able to read a text basically from the letter to the Romans, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And that text, basically, when he read it, that precisely changed his life. You know his story, basically, and it really changed his life drastically in 60 degrees. That it basically eventually led to the recognition of his holiness and eventually became a saint. So there is that capacity of the text to actually influence us or entice us. But it's not always positive. Sometimes we use the text to maybe like a tool that we can use against other people. But hopefully in general, the text itself will always influence us positively. that will always like really push us to realize what the text is trying to say. The third one is the conversation with the text as some form of correlation. We already know that because in the previous slide we talk about correlation, whether that be identity or we identify with the text or we basically pinpoint the similarity and the difference from what the text is saying and from what basically is our own experience, and also yung confrontation when we try to say that I'm different or I contrast myself from the text itself. So these are basically pressures that will always play up in our mind, in our life, when we interpret the text. That's why our job, our duty is only to take account of them. That means to control them, to make sure that you are not carried by all of these biases and presuppositions, but you basically know that when you interpret the text, sometimes one of these things, pressures, could actually play up in the interpretation. Okay, is that clear? So this is something that we cannot avoid. It's part of us, but we just have to be responsible enough to police our biases and presuppositions. One that can lead us astray and will not help us sometimes interpret the text objectively. So be mindful of these realities. Number 4, the serious reader tries to understand what the author writes. I think it's basic. When you're reading something, when you're reading a book or an article and you know there's an author, as much as possible, you try to understand what the author is trying to say. So in this exercise, the first place of that understanding is the text. What really the text is saying, not what we think the text is saying. So not the interpretation of the text alone, but what the text is saying. So to understand is a going and coming from the text to the reader and from the reader to the text. That's why when we are meditating on a passage, when we're trying to understand it, we really have to take some time to be able to really make sure that we understand the text very well, and we're not just basically interpreting it, reading it according to our own convenience and so on. So that's why when we have a text, this calls for obedient listening. So this calls for obedient listening. Just a second, I'm just going to sign a paper at this here. So anyway, so the text definitely would call us for obedient listening. It's a way also of preventing our own basically of preventing us from imposing our own meaning to the text. That's why it's important to pay attention to what the text is actually saying. It's not basically an experience of trying to express or interpret the text and understand the text according to how I want it to mean basically to me. So that's not obedient listening. So to listen and to understand constitute the response of man to God's words and deeds. And this is basically our own obligation and duty to the text, to listen to it and eventually to be obedient to what the text is saying. So it's important. Now, number 5, the proper place of the Bible is in the church. So the church is a community of faith existed before the creation of the Bible. Thus, it is the environment of the Bible. If you remember, we had an exercise, I think in September, was that in September, when I asked you to read the rest of the text on the non-significant books in the Bible. I'm sorry, non-canonical books in the Bible. and then you made some comments and asked some questions. So there was a sometimes Catholics would just easily blurt out and say that it is the Catholic basically that is the who created the Bible, who wrote the Bible. To a certain degree that may be true, but I don't think it is exactly true, because I don't think that the communities that created or wrote or have written the text of the Bible, they didn't even know themselves. They didn't actually identify themselves as Catholics. So the Catholic Christianity only came out when there was already divisions in Christianity. So basically, from the very beginning, it's just a Christian community. Whether you call it Catholic or not, it's anachronistic actually to do that. But at least from our experience in our own tradition, we basically have maintained that connection with the early Christian community. But anyway, it's true that it is the Christian community, but it's not necessarily the Catholic Christian community, because that already came after the Reformation or something like that. It is a Christian community of faith that created, or at least that produced, the Bible. That's why the only environment for the Bible is basically the Christian community of faith. So if somebody is reading the text and interpreting it without faith, this will just be a book, an ordinary book, and probably it will amuse you, sometimes give you some information, but it will not mean anything. So that's why there are a lot of questions regarding the text itself, because people are reading it from different vantage points. But the Bible can only make sense if you really understand it with that kind of faith that is expected about it. Outside of it, in many cases, it will probably appear senseless or not meaningful, and so on, or not true, and things like that. But if you have faith, if you understand that this text is born out of an experience of faith of people, then you can easily basically understand it. So if that is the case, then that the church as a community basically existed before the creation of the Bible, means that the Bible is a product of the reflection and sharing and preaching of the community of faith before that. So if that is the case, then biblical interpreters are not only responsible to the truth as they see it in the text, but also to the Christian community from which the Bible originated, nourishes. In one of the criterion for canonicity for a book of the Bible to be considered canon is what is called the rule of faith. So that means there is a certain kind of faith that can only fit basically with the story that is in the Bible. Like, for example, that you believe in one God, and that this God basically is manifested himself in three persons. But if you don't believe in God in the first place, so there's no point in reading this Bible, and this Bible is not going to be meaningful. And we also that this God is, although he is one God, that same God is also in three different persons. So those are basically the basic things that are in the rule of faith. Any teaching that goes against basically these realities is not going to fit into the environment of the Bible, and much more the Bible will not be able to actually speak to them, because basically this is the context of it. So it's important that the tradition of the Christian community in general, or even our tradition also, will have to be taken into consideration when we are interpreting. It is true that individual can make their own interpretation of the text, but in terms of using the fruit of this interpretation, it's definitely first and foremost personal. That's why you cannot impose it on other people. But of course, if it happens that your sharing becomes also the sharing of the others and the rest, then Just you just have to celebrate that. That's part of your uh, being together in the same tradition, in the same Christian community. That's why you share basically some of the interpretation of the text itself. So that's important. So you take into account the Christian community from which the Bible originated and which the Bible eventually nourishes, is the community which the Bible nourishes. They are therefore to consider also the faith of the Christian community in their interpretations. So that's why if you interpret the text outside of the our tradition, for example, as Catholics, then you become no longer a Catholic. To a certain degree, you may be a Christian, but you don't share the Catholic tradition. So there is there is already a difference. Likewise, the Bible interpreters have also to take into account the world, the present world. That's why to interpret today, one cannot do away with, because this is already like our context today. We are the ones interpreting it, and we are a community and people of faith, but we are living in this practically world that we have. So when we interpret the text, we have to take into consideration everything around us, everything around the community of faith, everything about around the individual who is a believer. That's why to interpret, one has to put together the concerns of the text, because sometimes the text has its own dynamics, the church, the world, and one's own in one's work, in one's interpretation. So that means when you are interpreting, there is something about that interpretation that caters to yourself, to the world, how you deal with the world, how you look at it, with the church, how the church, the community of faith, basically could be influenced, hopefully positively by it. And then, of course, the questions regarding the text, the problems with regards to the literature, the text that you're reading. So these are considerations that you have to take into account. So you cannot just interpret the text and say, "This is my interpretation, and that's correct for me." So you cannot question it. No, because we are in a community. We have our tradition, general tradition that is common for everyone. So your interpretation, even if it's personal and it's applicable to only your person, should also be what do you call this, determined and influenced by the whole understanding and what do you call this, tradition of the community to which you belong. Otherwise, you cease to belong to a community if you don't follow that same tradition. Number 6, the study of the Bible is like the study of a work of art. So I don't know if you have studied basically, if you have taken art appreciation when you study basically many of these artworks like paintings and so on. But you can actually see some what do you call this, similarities in this study. A work of art, imagine for example a painting. A work of art is a reflection of an aspect of the universe. So that means when a painter paints something, he paints something that he fascinates him. It could be people, it could be just scenery, it could be like any object that he sees around him. So it's a reflection of an aspect of his universe. So the artist also, when he tried to pick what do you call this, a subject for his painting, he has also something in mind in terms of what is he trying to tell to people who will see his painting. So he has an audience that he expects that when they see basically his artwork, he is basically trying to influence them to react to it in a way that the author basically or the artist intended. So that is I think important. Of course, the basic expectation of the artist is that you'll be able to appreciate it like beautiful, but it could also be like it's beautiful and it's also like very reflective and so on. So anyway, In the process of the work of art, there are different methods, basically, that stresses different elements in the dynamics of creating a work of art and creating it for people or particular audience like that, and capturing an aspect of the universe. So when you look at a work of art, basically it involves three things: the universe, from which basically the aspect that is captured in the work of art is patterned from, and then the artist himself who basically did the work of art, taking into consideration that aspect of the universe, at the same time the possible audience that who would be appreciating his work. And the third one is the audience, because the audience can interpret the art according to the author's mind, but he is also independent to interpret it according to his own context. He can interpret it differently from it. But of course, it's always good to consider that in the whole process of coming up with a work of art, these three things have to be considered. There is the universe, there is the artist, and there is the audience. That is also true with the Bible, the text of the Bible. So the contents of the Bible that we have, or specific books and specific passages that you find there, basically it will tell you about historical events or theological ideas. But of course, a particular passage will not be able to contain everything. Even a particular book will not be able to basically encompass everything or get to everything. It's not possible. It's difficult. So, but that's why you only get a portion of the historical events that had happened in the salvation history and theological days and like that. So the author would choose those that many things, and he basically arrange or make use of these different ideas and historical events, put them together for a certain message that he wants to get across to the readers. But at the same time, the readers can actually read the text even apart from what the author is trying to what do you call this inculcate, because the reader has his own context that can also uh, give pressure for him or her to be able to interpret it in a way that is helpful in his own context. So that's basically the difference. So there are already three elements. Aside from the text itself, you also have basically the historical events or theological ideas that is represented, and then the author who put all of these things together, and the reader who is the intended recipient or readers later on, basically that will benefit from the text itself. So before the age of the Enlightenment, you will see that these different aspects that we basically see here, will in the process of interpreting the text will be actually emphasized at certain points in history. So that's why before the age of the Enlightenment, the Bible was seen mostly for its theological ideas and historical events. So what does that mean? That the things written in the Bible were thought of, people were thinking that that is the truth about it at that time, to be what was really meant and actually took place. So that's why the Bible, before the age of the Enlightenment, like before the 17th century, so that means from the very, very start until about the Middle Ages, people were thinking that the Bible was enough to explain everything around them. And then what the Bible is saying is the reality about it. So that was what they were thinking about. That's why it was able to answer questions regarding nature, regarding what is happening in the sky, and so on. So practically people, for anything, will always go back to the Bible to interpret things. And what the Bible is saying was actually the last say on a lot of things in the experiences of people at that time. Now, when the period of modern criticism came, which basically was brought about by this age of the Enlightenment, the Bible was seen as literary work like all others of ancient times. I'm sure you have read some of this when you read through the interpretation in the ancient times, and then the interpretation in the modern and the postmodern period. So these are basically, I'm just saying, basically presenting historically what had happened in terms of the development of the study of the text. So that's basically what happened. So when the period of modern criticism came, the Bible was seen as a literary work, like all the others literary pieces in ancient times. So as such, it could be comprehended only if we understood the author and his historical situation. So the study of the text was not just drawing out theological ideas and historical events, but it shifted to focusing on what the author is trying to say and what his historical situation basically would say about the text and what helped in the interpretation of the text. So the interest shifted to the author and his times. In This is also what is sometimes called historical criticism. That is part of it. The meaning of the text became dependent on the meaning or intention of the biblical writer. So they were saying you can only understand well what the text is saying if you understand who the author is and be able to understand basically the condition, the situation, and the mindset of the author himself. So that's basically what happened. So the meaning became dependent not just on what the text is saying, but on the author and his times. So after almost 2 centuries of historical studies, scholars realized that they were achieving little compared to their effort. So they realized that in studying the author and his times, you can actually get to something, but you'll actually definitely reach a dead end. That's why in many of our discussions on the text, you will see later on as you go about studying all the biblical books, you will realize that there is when it talks about authorship, there is nothing basically conclusive that we can get out of it because we hardly have any documents that will tell us about specific authors at that time. So that's basically what happened. That their efforts were achieving very little. So they knew more about what the Bible had been in the past or could have been as it was being composed than what the text is saying now as it is. So because they were so focused on the author and his times. So this brings us to the present day study of that text itself. So that means that you can study the Bible by just focusing on the text, independent of its author and the previous evolution of its parts. So that means if you read the text, it's not so much important to no longer very, very important that you get to know the author and his times to be able to understand it. Because what the present day people would try to do is read the text and interpret it in a way that can speak to them right then and there in their own experience. So the word of God is the text itself as we have it in the text, as it in the Bible. So it is to be understood as it is. So somehow this is a kind of a canonical reading of the text. That means what is approved as canonical text is already the text that matters. So that's why if we interpret it now according to how we see it and how we understand it in our own experience in this present context, then it's also valid, basically. So this kind of preoccupation with the text itself is done by the synchronic methods such as structuralism and canonical criticism, as I mentioned. We'll go into that in the second half of this lesson, which we will tackle tomorrow. But then another approach is gaining ground today, especially in the postmodern context. Basically, the text has meaning because of the reader. Not only that, meaning does not only come to the reader from the text, but also from the reader to the text. So it's not probably so much imposing the meaning to the text, but sometimes your own context will help you interpret the text in a way that help yourself become better. So the reader is an important factor in interpretation. So he or she is not just a recipient. He also like actively dialogue and maybe haggle and then argue or debate with the text and even raise questions about it. So methods of interpretation are now being employed, such as rhetorical criticism and narrative analysis, that consider the hermeneutical factor of the reader itself. So as we see, different methods attach various elements of Bible interpretation. And we will see that when we focus on these different methods, as I've said, tomorrow. Number 7, based on the above discussion, there are 3 basic disciplines in biblical studies in general. One is historical. The historical studies would deal with the historical development of the text and their sources, the historical situations that brought about the text, the historical events reflected by them. Historical. The second one is literary. Literary studies range from the study of words, grammar, language, and literary genres to the ways a text is to be interpreted. So as a literary work, the Bible can be subjected to the scientific methods of studying any kind of literature. And the third one is theological. The Bible is also God's word of salvation. So it's just right that it has theological relevance for the times when the books were written, as also for us now, hence the theological studies. So we study them basically as part of our own legacy in our community of faith. Number 8, what is the purpose of biblical interpretation? According to the International Biblical Commission, number 75, it is a question of overcoming the distance between the time of the authors and the first addressees of the biblical text and our own contemporary age, and of doing so in a way that permits a correct actualization of the scriptural message so that the Christian life of faith may find nourishment. Now, there are so many words in that sentence. I think what is important to remember is that if your interpretation nourishes your faith, your Christian life, then that's the right interpretation. But if your interpretation doesn't improve your living out of your Christian life, then those are useless interpretation, basically. So that's what it's trying to say. Of course, the process is to lessen the gap of the distance, but it's basically mainly to really find nourishment for our Christian life. So interpretation of the Bible ends not just in understanding, but in living the Word of God. So the text has to be made relevant to the people of our time. Again, according to the IBC, in church tradition, the fathers, as first interpreters of Scripture, considered that their exegesis of text was complete only when it had found a meaning relevant to the situation of Christians in their own day. That's why interpretation of the text, of course, isn't just for us, but it's also for our society and it's also for people around us. So we need to be challenged by the text itself in trying to transform ourselves, our situation, and so on, and even improve our own Christian life and nourish it along the way. So basically, that's the more important meaning. What you call this reason why we need to interpret the text.